I'm Neil Theise. I'm a physician in New York City at Mount Sinai Beth Israel Medical Center and practice diagnostic pathology. My research is in liver stem cells, cell biology and how cells are self-organizing systems that create our bodies. And that led me into integrative medicine, mind-body medicine, and then eventually into consciousness studies. So the idea of learning how stem cells are part of all the cells that create a tissue and how tissues create our bodies can be described in terms of complexity theory, something that sounds complicated but is pretty simple. It's how systems of interacting individuals, whether it's people walking down the street, ants in an ant colony, birds in a flock, or the cells in our bodies, organize themselves into larger scale structures, not because anybody has planned it, but just because the local interactions between them give rise to food lines of ants, patterns of people flowing down the sidewalk, or like a flock of birds. And so we started talking about stem cells and the cells that derive from them as very much like we talk about ants or humans self-organizing, and thinking about it in terms of how the initial cells, the embryonic stem cells, become the embryo and give rise to the fetus and give rise to the postnatal child, and then grow as you go through adolescence into an adult body. All of this is, at the cellular level, is just cells interacting with each other. No cell is thinking, how do I make a human? They're just interacting with the cells nearby, and somehow out of this, in a bottom-up way, we have our bodies. So that immediately implies that you can have hierarchies of such systems. So we know that a community of humans form cities. You know, in New York, there's where I live, there's a street where it's all Indian restaurants, 6th Street. No one zoned the city to make the Indian restaurants all be there. Yet somehow they just self-organized. And it turns out that if you look at small businesses in large cities, they actually do better business if they aggregate in small neighborhoods. And this just happens spontaneously, whether it's in Paris or London or Hong Kong, you find this phenomenon. And in New York, one of the examples is 6th Street Indian restaurants. So you get this sort of thing happening at the social level. But the social level is constructed of humans. Again, like a flock of birds is constructed of birds. From a distance, a flock of birds looks like a thing. It may be moving, but it looks like a solid shape. But if someone says, oh, that's a flock, you go, oh, right, of course, it's just a bunch of birds. But because of the way we're talking about biology, well, each bird, if you go up to the microscopic level, well, there's no bird, it's just cells. So this made it seem like cells are the fundamental unit that self-organize into biological structures. And that's the foundation of Western biology. When we talk about Western medicine and Western biology, what we're saying is that all living things are made of cells. That's what defines Western. But the Greeks had asked, before we had microscopes, it was a philosophical question. So our body's made of indivisible subunits, and they called them atoms. So it used to be that physics borrowed from biology, their terms. Or is it an endlessly divisible fluid continuum? Can you just keep dividing and dividing? And then when they invented the microscope, they could see cell membranes and cell walls, which formed an empty box, 4 walls, ceiling, and a floor. And we called them cells because they were like the cell of a monk or a prisoner. There was no furniture inside. And an empty box you can't subdivide. So the argument was settled. The body is made of atoms, and we'll call them cells. And 20 years later, they started figuring out what the furniture was. Golgi apparatus, nuclei, mitochondria, things like that. So I was thinking about this and asked the question, well, what if the technology had been different? What if they had first seen the nuclei, not the cell membranes? Then they wouldn't have said, oh, the body is made of atoms. They would have said, oh, look, it's an endlessly divisible fluid. But there are these balls floating in it, so they would figure out what those balls were. And in the process, maybe 20 years later, they'd see the cell membranes. They wouldn't have said we were wrong. They would have said, oh, look, the fluid space, it has divisions in it, and they're semi-permeable, so it's not, so flow is a little bit more difficult, it's impeded. But they wouldn't have changed their model. The body would be fluid, and Western medicine and Western biology would be a fluid model, which turns out, incidentally, to be a much easier way to analyze and explain a lot of acupuncture data, which isn't anatomically based. And if you can't describe it in terms of anatomy, you can't describe it in terms of its building blocks, namely cells, which is probably why we've had such a hard time understanding what acupuncture is. So from that perspective, cells aren't a fundamental thing. At a lower level of scale, it's just biomolecules self-organizing themselves in the fluid. So are biomolecules a thing? Well, they're just self-organizing atoms. Well, what about atoms? Well, they're just self-organizing subatomic particles, which are smaller, self-organizing smaller subatomic particles. The next level down, no one's sure what those are. They might be strings, they might be smaller particles, but there is nothing smaller because now we're down at the Planck length, 10 to the minus 36th meters, I think. I'm a liver pathologist. And at that level, they're not subdividing into smaller things. They're just coming in and out of existence. It's energy turning into matter, which turns back into energy in what's called the quantum foam. And the details of that vary depending on what theory you have. But what physicists all agree on is, out of the vacuum, stuff is erupting. And that stuff, whatever it erupts into, whether it's strings or some other tiny thing, then self-organize into the larger scale subatomic particles, into bigger subatomic particles, into atoms, into molecules, into the universe. So suddenly the entire universe is a self-organizing system in which no thing actually exists as a thing. How this gets into consciousness studies, it comes in a couple of ways. First off, there's the idea that in quantum physics, the idea of an observer is essential to the outcome of any experiment. The minute an observation is made in an experiment, a definitive outcome happens. But before that outcome happens, before it's observed, all the possibilities exist in a superposition. Everything is possible. So the classical Schrödinger's cat thing, the cat is both dead and alive in a superposition. Is that really happening? Is it really both dead and alive? There are different philosophical interpretations. But the majority of the founders of quantum physics, and with shades of difference between them, felt that, and this is still the most robust approach to quantum physics, that consciousness is inherent in the universe coming into being at any given moment. So we have this self-organizing universe in which there is no thing that actually has inherent existence. And at its most fundamental levels, consciousness is what drives it, what creates it, what allows it to become what it is in each moment. Then you can't ask what any part of the universe is without asking what's its relationship to consciousness. And that seems to place the idea of consciousness at a lower level of scale than up here where our brain is creating the mind. So this is the essential divide philosophically, is does the brain create mind, or does the universe create mind when it becomes sufficiently complex in structure? And some people would say only a human brain can do that. Some people would say only a primate brain. Some would say only a central nervous system. Some would say only those with a nervous system. It doesn't have to be organized into a central nervous system. And some people, in particular, Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela from Chile, had this idea of autopoietic theory. They were trying to ask the question, how do you define life? And what they came to is that the smallest thing that fulfills the criteria for being alive is a single cell. And that is involved with having a boundary, defining inside and outside, and a certain kind of sensing that happens between inside and outside, and interactions across that boundary. It's significantly more complex than that, but that's a reasonable approximation. And they said that that is the simplest form of mind in the same way that it is the simplest form of life. And an example that's commonly given is you have a paramecium, a single-cell animal that has little hairs that act like oars, and it's swimming towards up this way, and it comes up against a boundary. And if you watch it, it hits the boundary, will back up, change direction, hit the boundary again, back up, change direction, until it finds a way to get around the boundary. It looks from the outside like it has mind and it is finding its way past the boundary. What we know is happening is that it hits the boundary, the cell membrane deforms where it hits. That opens calcium channels in the cell membrane. Calcium flows out, and that acts as a signal which get the flagellae to move in the opposite direction, so it backs up. The calcium diffuses away, they return back to normal, but because the water itself isn't static, there's a little turbulence. It's going to have a slightly different direction. So this idea of sentience, this sensing of the environment and responding to the environment isn't machine-like. It's not like an air conditioner turning on and off. The way the paramecium decided to make that change is that there were complex molecular interactions happening within the cell and with the cell membrane that caused calcium to flow out when the membrane deforms, etc. It's not always precisely the same. And in fact, you can describe that as a self-organizing phenomenon of the molecules that make up the paramecium inside. So you can define sentience as not only sensing the world outside the organism and responding, because that could be like an air conditioner. An air conditioner senses the world and responds. But the internal processing of the information that's sensed happens according to the rules of a complex system. And one of the aspects of complex systems is there's always a little randomness in the system. That's how self-organizing systems can be adaptive and change if the environment changes, because they're not machine-like. They're not going to do the same thing every time regardless of the environment. They're not too disordered, because then there'd be no self-organization at all. It's got to be a low level of randomness. So we tied, this was work I did with Minos Kafatos. We tied the idea of sentience to this internal processing like a complex system. And there had to be some level of randomness in that system. The question is it only a cell that does that? And it turns out DNA molecules do that in a simpler fashion, but they still do it. Some enzymes you can demonstrate do it. So are these the only things? Are these alive? Do these have mind? And technically speaking, I mean, it's a little bit complicated to do quickly in an interview, but in fact you can find ever simpler but still concrete examples of this all the way down to the lowest levels of scale. And so it seems that sentience, as defined according to autopoiesis, doesn't stop at the cell. It's not that if it's alive, it has mind. If it has mind, it's alive. You can find evidence of even simpler mind further down. Calling that sentience has turned out to be very sticky for a lot of people. And we're willing to back off a bit. Currently, we're saying that what we're really talking about here, a better term for it at lower levels of scale is creative interactivity. We're just coming up with labels. And the fact is, whether you call it sentience or creative interactivity or basketball, it's still, there isn't, at every level of scale, even down in the smallest quantum levels, there is this sensing of the environment and making a response that isn't always precisely the same. So there's a little bit of randomness in the system. So there can be room for creativity. And that creative interactivity or sentience or basketball is the fundamental thing that allows the universe to self-organize. Because if things don't interact with each other, there's no self-organization. So this was actually how I started thinking more deeply about the consciousness aspects, this idea that you could trace sentience all the way down. But then when you tie that together with quantum physics, you suddenly start to get a sense of a more seamless view of the universe. I'm also a Zen student. I've been practicing for 25 years. And one can have experiences in contemplative states that point in the direction also that, consciousness isn't something being produced by here. I can experience my consciousness in other parts of my body. I mean, part of the practice, formal Zen practice, is focusing it in what's in Japanese called the hara, or your second chakra. And it's actually feeling like your mind is situated there. Our habit of feeling like our minds are in our brains comes more because most of our sense organs are up here. It's not because our brain is here. Our face is here. And you can even play games with experiencing it outside of your body. If with enough practice, you can do that sort of thing if you feel like it. But in still deeper states, you get a sense that, actually what underlies the mind is some larger mind. Some traditions will describe it as pure awareness, the mind of clear light in Tibetan Buddhism, awareness of awareness. So one can have these experiences that are well documented in many different cultures. Why is that not a viable hypothesis for where mind comes from? And in fact, in Western philosophy, it's not exactly an outsider idea either. A lot of what Plato was talking about, certainly Spinoza, Hegel, Kant, Whitehead, folding quantum physics into all of that with process theory. We're all suggesting in one way or another that consciousness is what things arise out of. It's not a product of the universe. The universe is a product of that. So Minas and I are trying to formalize that view because it hasn't really been formalized in a contemporary, and hopefully eventually, this is his job, mathematical sort of way. My inclination, when you put all my streams of thought and experience together, is that, I think actually consciousness is what comes first. And everything arises from that. And I think that's a simpler way to look at the world. The hard problem of consciousness, how do I experience qualia like redness or the taste of a pizza or a happy memory? That's a problem if you think your brain has made your mind. But if you think that mind is what gave rise to the universe, then the entire universe is nothing but qualia. The problem sort of disappears because there isn't anything else. That's all anything is. So in some ways I find that satisfying, although a lot of people find that really irritating. It's sort of hackneyed a little bit, but I really like it, the radio metaphor. If I grew up on a desert island and had never seen a radio, and you showed me a radio for the first time, I might want to open it up and see if the Beatles were inside. But there are no Beatles inside. The radio isn't creating the mind. It's transducing radio waves, which are infinite in extent, sampling them at a very narrow frequency, and transducing them into something I can hear. The choice of transducing it into an oral experience, that's up to whoever built the radio. You could just as easily transduce it into light, and our computers do that all the time. If we want a light show to go with our music, then you get light. So, on the one hand, you might say the brain makes music, makes mind, makes consciousness, and that is the emergentist position. Or you might say that life makes mind, and that's another emergentist position. I'd say that, no, maybe the brain, what's remarkable about the brain, or what's remarkable about living things, is that they can transduce the global consciousness, the foundational consciousness, into information that is appropriately adaptive for that particular organism. So I don't transduce consciousness the way a bat transduces consciousness or a paramecium transduces consciousness. They'd be very confused by my sensorium, and I'd be very confused by theirs. What we're doing is transducing the information necessary to continue adaptively as a functioning entity in a living system that's our ecosystem. Don Hoffman has done some really nice work where he models, I may have some of the details of this wrong, but in general, he's modeling evolutionary behavior in virtual creatures. I think this is kind of what he's doing, to see whether or not creatures that have a more accurate sense of the actual world, rather than those that have a less accurate sense of it, are better fit evolutionarily and survive and adapt better within the model system he's creating. And it turns out that a better view of reality actually is non-adaptive. Those creatures are less fit. And the fact is that we actually see a very limited amount of the sensory input that other creatures see. We see different sets of information, and we actually see far less than we think we see. Our brains construct a full visual field, but we know that there's no vision where the optic nerve is. But you have to work really hard to train yourself to see where the blind spot is, where your optic nerve sits. Our brain fills it in. It does much more than that. So I find that the people who argue, well, our brains are giving us a true sense of the world, that's because our brains and our create minds that can do this, they're sort of gliding past the fact that our brains, if that is the case, are creating an extremely limited view. And that may be adaptive, but it's not, I find it much more satisfying to think that our brains are selectively extracting information from a foundational consciousness that's appropriate for me as a living system. And the fact that my brain is different than a mouse, we're extracting different information, so we have different minds. I just find that an easier sort of approach. My mom has a little bit of dementia. She has very little short-term memory. Otherwise, she's completely intact. And she's sort of like my little consciousness experiment. And a couple of years ago, she was talking about being confused, and she's no longer bothered by that because we've got good home care for her. She's totally safe and comfortable. She doesn't have any anxiety. And she said, I'm confused. And I said, what's it like being confused? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, is it sort of like random thoughts happening? She said, no, that's not it. I said, is it kind of like a radio that you can't quite tune to the right frequency? She goes, that's exactly it. Sometimes I get multiple stations, or then the station just keeps switching on me. And just the other day I was in London. Well, you live in New York, and she never leaves the apartment. The idea that that metaphor was so immediately identifiable to her. We talk about people with dementia as having brains that are broken, and thus the minds they're creating are broken minds. My mom's experience isn't that her mind is broken. It's just not tuning well. And within that, she's perfectly comfortable. And within that, she also starts to have really weird experiences, and this is the stuff I'm not supposed to talk about at consciousness meetings, but at SANS I can talk about it. She sees dead people all the time. She's gotten information from dead people about the world before I did, finding it out in the real world. 2 times that happened. There are only 2 times. Skeptics would say those are anecdotes. Maybe I misinterpreted. But her self-report, she's very clear and very verbal, is that she's perceiving things in other frequencies because she can tune to those other frequencies. I think that's evidence. I think that's data about the nature of mind. When you talk to someone like Dean Radin, who has this vast, or Julia Mossbridge, vast amount of data for psi-type things like precognition, viewing at a distance. The paradigm that the brain creates mind closes down our ability to look at that as data that should inform our hypothesizing. I'm much happier saying, hey, look at all this data. Can we create a hypothesis that incorporates all this? Particularly when the data is so robust and so good. So this view also, I think, I'm happier both as a pathologist and as a scientist with theories that can allow for creativity and flexibility of response. And those that lead to having to reject parts of the world as not being seen because otherwise the hypothesis is challenged. I find that to be not scientific and not fun. So. No, it's informing my work to some extent. Very early on in the stem cell work, we were finding that cells were doing things they're not supposed to do. In our case, initially, cells of the bone marrow, which are only supposed to produce blood cells, were turning out to produce liver cells. That's how I got into that. And then it turns out they produced everything else. And that led to actually cells can do anything they want if you treat them the right way. That led us to talk 12, 13 years ago about cellular uncertainty, which when I first wrote about that, I used the phrase to be challenging to my cell biology colleagues. And my initial publications on cellular uncertainty, I was saying, well, we're using Heisenberg's uncertainty as a metaphor here. Maybe it's possible to construct a perfect MRI machine that will tell you everything that's going on in a cell and be able to predict everything about it. But right now, we don't have that capacity. That was exactly what Heisenberg said at the time when he first came up with the uncertainty principle. We do not yet have a tool that can allow us to measure everything. Maybe we can have one day, and then this will disappear. Though it quickly became evident that no, this is the way the universe is. Cellular uncertainty turns out to be exactly the same because cell systems, this is another aspect of complexity, these are fractal systems. And so there's an exquisite sensitivity to conditions for how any living complex system is going to behave. And so any slight manipulation of a cell or of a human or of a community will have potentially vast unintended consequences. There is no such thing as being able to measure everything about a cell without in fact changing the cell at the same time. So then I was happy to say that this is a biological version of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Working with Minas, this is actually where we sort of started. When we started working together, it was just him teaching me the way he sees things and me teaching him how I see things. And we got to this and started to unpack it and then realized there were similarly quantum-like things outside of the quantum realm, like entanglement, superposition, complementarity, etc. All of these things have correlates in the classical and in the biological scales. So I think entanglement is a useful term, but the way Minas and I talk about it is there's quantum, the stuff as it's defined and was first discovered in the quantum realm, and there's quantum-like phenomena. But it's not just metaphorical. And I think had people first noticed these in the biological realm, they would have named them in the biological realm. And then when they found them in the quantum realm, they would have said, oh, this is like that stuff. Very much like cells. Oh, these are atoms. So it depends on who gets there first and notices the phenomenon. Quantum theory allowed our imaginations to see what was there in the biological world. But it might have been possible that that biology would have been seen beforehand and then recognized as having a parallel in the quantum world. So I think these are actually features of the universe at every level of scale. But at different levels of scale, they look a little bit different. What I was referring to was initially working with Jane Prophet, who is an English artist. Now she's living in Hong Kong. And we got together because a mutual friend of ours thought we would enjoy each other's company. And his job was curating art science interdisciplinary things, and something both Jane and I thought that would be cool. Jane has done this kind of thing before to some extent. We could get funding for this because there's an interest in Europe particularly of exploring how interdisciplinary approaches often give rise to more creative problem solving. Rather than, you've got an engineering problem, get 5 engineers and have them talk about it, the range of solutions you're going to get is fairly narrow. So the reason we were funded is they were interested in funding a bunch of different groups and seeing which turned into creative interactions and which ones didn't, and get a sense then of how to create such interdisciplinary interactions with a likelihood of being creative for problem-solving sort of stuff, whether it's for the military, the government, social, whatever. So our initial interactions were simply her coming to New York 3 times and me going to London 3 times, and all we had to do was record our conversations, either audio tape or video. And we found, much like Mount Sinai, spending time talking to each other, we just had lots of conversations on the phone until we started to notice there were things that were linkages between his work and my work. The same with Jane and I. And the creativity comes in part because you're not looking to make a product. You're not trying to get somewhere. You're just saying, tell me what you do and I'll tell you what I do. And then you start to notice things. So when I was telling Jane about stem cells, she had created a virtual world called Technosphere that made a major splash at the time it came out, which I think is now 15 or 20 years ago. She was interested in how people interact with virtual creatures. And so she got together with an artificial life programmer, with a programmer. And they created this world, and you could create little creatures and send them out into the world, and the creatures would send little email postcards to you. You'd make an herbivore or carnivore, might send you a postcard saying, oh, I outran a carnivore today. Oh, I mated with an herbivore. Oh, I got pregnant. But it turned out that when there were thousands of these creatures that people using the program had created, were sent out into Technosphere, the creatures started creating social structures that they had not coded. They didn't program them, and yet they started happening. And so they got a lot of attention as having created this artificial life thing. And her response initially, she told me, was, no, we haven't created artificial life. We've created artificial life. And the artificial life people were like, no, Technosphere is alive. A key element of that is there's this low-level randomness in the system that I talked about before that allows a little creative adaptability, not too much, not too little. So when I was talking about the stem cell controversies, bone marrow cells can become liver, and we'd shown that. At first, the idea was rejected. Then, when people said, okay, it happens, but it happens so infrequently, it's not really important. Because in most of our model systems, it happened like 1 in 1,000 cells, 1 in 10,000 cells. So it was dismissed as trivial. And when I told her about that, she said, that's like random ants. That's like the randomness in Technosphere. Just a little low-level randomness, but that was vital to making the thing a living thing. And so we started to explore how our low-level stem cell activity was actually a form of the quench disorder, or the low-level randomness that makes things a complex system. And this allowed us to unpack the idea of cells being members of a complex system and tissues self-organizing from those, the way a city does. So it was just us talking, and she noticed this thing. And I have the moment on film, and the date, and it was in my office because everything had to be recorded. We then expanded the team, brought in a mathematician who does agent-based modeling, which is modeling little interacting creatures in a mathematically though, and a guy who does programming for this kind of stuff, and we formed the Cell team, and I started to download everything I knew about stem cells to this mathematician, programmer, and artist, and projects started erupting from it, and we became very productive. And I saw the programmer in Australia, he's moved there now, a few months ago, and we were thinking back, all of our careers are completely different than they might have been had the four of us not met. And I wouldn't certainly be here talking about this stuff if it weren't for this. So by having the right combination, without top-down planning, like a complex system, with just the right bit of crazy in there, all this amazing stuff has erupted for all four of us. So we're sort of an example of the thing that we're talking about, too. A couple of things. First off, even before I started to think about my science, before I started to think about the spiritual stuff from a scientific point of view, that was never a goal or an intent or an interest of mine. The fact that they wandered together is a surprise to me. But way before that, all my most creative ideas, science-wise, happened while I was sitting meditating on a cushion. I had the question boiling around in my brain that I was looking for an answer for, worrying away at it, but then I would be sitting on a cushion at some point and suddenly, bing, there was the idea. A lot of scientists will talk about, I went to sleep and I woke up, there it was. It's a similar sort of thing. So the practice of meditation itself, it's very mysterious. No one knows how this happens. It's not that the meditation is mysterious, creativity is mysterious. But somehow meditation fosters that. And so that would have been enough. The thing about Zen practice in particular is there is a kind of meditation called koan meditation. The most famous koan is, what's the sound of one hand clapping? That's not the answer. These are things, they're usually stories of a student and a teacher having an interaction out of which the student comes to an awakening moment. And one could say that the goal of meditating with a koan is to sort of share the experience that's being represented in the koan, although some of them are not like that, like one hand clapping. The way one holds a koan in one's mind is that you're told to become one with the koan. You become the koan. And when I was working on the stem cell stuff and thinking about my body made of cells, I was walking down the street one day and the light changed. This was at Park Avenue and 21st Street on the northwest corner. It was a very vivid experience. The light changed and I couldn't lift my leg to get across the street because while I was waiting, I was getting so caught up in how my body is made of the cells that I'm studying that I couldn't move. And I started having this experience a number of times. And then I was sitting in the Zendo one. I used to be responsible for opening the Zendo Thursday mornings. And for many years, early on in the history of my Zendo, it's much busier now, I was the only one there. And I was meditating Thursday morning. And I wasn't doing my Zen meditation. I was thinking about stem cells and my body as a community of cells. And I looked up inappropriately, and I saw the stick of incense on the altar turning into smoke. And all of a sudden I had a vivid experience of my body as that flock of cells, not a solid thing, but. And I went to talk to my teacher when I had the opportunity, and I said, is this kind of like Buddhist ideas of the emptiness of inherent existence? And that was my first taste of, oh, you're either a thing or a phenomenon arising from smaller things. And she said, yeah, that's it. I said, that's it? She goes, yeah, just because it's hard to experience doesn't mean it's not actually simple. So all of a sudden, for the very first time, my Zen practice itself led me to an experience that then led to a scientific insight. And now there's just sort of, they're just not separate worlds. The world is what it is, and I can experience it cognitively or experientially, and they just feed each other. I'm not afraid of that combine anymore. I often don't talk about it in hardcore science crowds. I often don't talk about it in hardcore spiritual crowds. Neither side is very comfortable with me eliding that boundary. But that's where I'm living these days.